Time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning the Environment Minister said, and I quote, "I would welcome a new coal-fired power station." Does the Prime Minister agree?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the coal has a very important role in our energy mix, and I have no doubt it will have for many, many years to come, possibly forever. Who can tell? The reality is that we have a technology-agnostic approach to energy policy. The subsidies are coming to an end. The renewable energy target will be complete in 2020. It will all be met. And what we have with the National Energy Guarantee is, for the first time, the combination of an ability to ensure that power is affordable, that it's reliable, that you have enough dispatchable power to keep the lights on, and, of course, that you meet the Paris commitments that we've entered into. Now, we are already seeing our energy policies working. Already we've seen the wholesale price of gas has halved in the last 18 months. There was a massive shortage of gas on the east coast of Australia, created by the Labor Party, created by a federal Labor government and a Queensland state Labor government that allowed gas to be exported from the east coast without any regard to the domestic consequences. Well, we've resolved that with additional gas supply. We're already seeing the wholesale cost of generation down 30% over the last year, and finally we're now starting to see a reduction in the cost of energy for mums and dads, for small businesses, for families. Retail prices are starting to come down, both families and for small business. So we're turning the corner on energy costs driven up by the combination of left-wing ideology and Labor incompetence. Ideology and idiocy, a very dangerous combination. That's what the Labor Party brings to economics. But, Mr. Speaker, today we've heard in the Leader of the Opposition's latest captain's call, his latest attack or riposte to the member for Grainler. Member for Grainler went out and said Labor should be friendly to business. So what does the Leader of the Opposition do? He says to thousands of family-owned small and medium businesses across the country, if he's elected Prime Minister, he's going to jack up their tax. That's what he wants to do. He is going to put at risk millions of Australians' jobs. So not only is he going to put up personal income tax, he's going to put up the tax of the businesses that employ more than half of the Australian private sector workforce.
Will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Mr. Speaker, just asking if there can be a passing reference that's relevant to the question about coal-fired power stations.
The Manager of Opposition Business, the Minister for the Environment and Energy will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business makes a valid point of order. There can be a passing reference. I was about to pull the Prime Minister up. That was a very specific question, and it was very specific to coal-fired power stations. The member for Dunkley has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how and why lower taxes are an important part of the government's plan for a stronger economy, including in my election of Dunkley? Is the Prime Minister aware of alternative approaches, including how higher taxes discourage investments and jobs?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr. Speaker, we know that lower taxes encourage businesses to invest. We know that lower company tax encourages business to invest and to employ. It supports stronger economic growth. It supports more jobs and higher wages. And every Labor leader, including the gentleman opposite, have made exactly that point in defence of reducing company tax. The member for McMahon famously wrote a book about it, so committed he was to it. 25% tax. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government has already achieved, through the parliament, a reduction in company tax for businesses with turnovers up to $50 million a year. These are overwhelmingly small and medium businesses, family-owned. They employ over half of the private sector workforce. They have been responding to the encouragement we've given by growing, by investing and building and growing their employment. Mr Speaker, now today I spoke to Wayne Light, who is one of the owners of Stubbs Constructions in Burnie. It's an 80-year-old firm. Wayne started off in that firm 40 years ago as an apprentice. Aspiration wasn't a mystery to him. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. He worked hard, he wanted to get ahead, and now he owns part of the business. Now he owns part of the business. His business is a turnover of around $20 million a year. It has 63 employees.
Member for Bendigo.
63 employees.
Member for Bendigo
and that business will face, were Labor to become the government, will face an increase in their tax. Now, they have been given, this is a strong Tasmanian business. It's the type of business that the Tasmanians are proud of, family-owned, long-standing, building. It's a construction company. It's building houses and schools, all sorts of facilities there on the northwest, and that is a company that we are backing, as we are backing thousands of other Australian companies. What does the Labor Party have to say to them? Pay more tax. That's what the Leader of the Opposition wants to do. Now, this announcement was made today by him without any reference to his shadow cabinet, without any reference to the caucus. We remember the moment when the member for McMahon was asked about what Labor's approach to our small and medium family company tax cuts would be, and he said, we will have more announcements to make in this space. Well, there was no we in the space today. It was just the Leader of the Opposition, a captain's call, seeking to counter-attack against the member for Grayndler. The only job he's interested in is his own.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Eden-Monaro has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The CEO of Snowy Hydro has clearly stated that building new coal-fired power plants, quote, doesn't stack up. And the Chief Operating Officer has said it would mean Snowy 2 is not viable. As the government is the sole shareholder, has advice been sought from Snowy Hydro about the impact of building new coal-fired power plants on the viability of Snowy 2?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, partisan divisions aside, I cannot thank the honourable member enough for asking me a question about Snowy Hydro. What a great demonstration of Australian engineering. What a great example of the vision, of governments in the past, Labor and coalition governments. And Snowy Hydro 2.0 is the next stage that is going to deliver thousands of jobs into the Eden-Monaro electorate, and it is going to provide secure, dispatchable baseload power into the future. Now, the honourable member referred to some remarks by Paul Broad. He is entitled to his opinion, he's entitled to his opinion. But we have a policy that is entirely technology agnostic. The National Energy Guarantee provides no disincentives for anyone to build a new coal-fired power station or refurbish an existing one, any more than it provides a disincentive for people to build more gas or indeed to build more hydro. What it does is prioritise dispatchability, which had been sadly missing from all of the green left energy policies of the Labor Party, and that, of course, supports thermal power. Now, as far as Snowy Hydro 2.0 is concerned, I'd remind the honourable member of this. Snowy Hydro 2.0 will be a big base load customer, of all providers of energy, generators, renewable, but including coal-fired power. A power station that runs 24 hours a day, like a coal-fired power station, does not have the same demand 24 hours of the day. A big pumped hydro scheme will be buying power from coal-fired generators in the off-peak times and will provide that off-peak baseload demand. So it is one that will provide support right across the industry. But the bottom line is, let the market decide on which technology to determine. No, let the market decide. What we are prioritising is affordability, reliability and meeting those emissions reduction targets. We can do all three. The NEG does it. It will bring down energy prices for the reasons that Paul Broad has advanced. It will bring down energy prices, and that is going to be good for families, it's going to be good for businesses, large and small, and above all, it's going to be great for Australian jobs.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House why it is important to have lower and more competitive taxes as part of a plan for a stronger economy? Is the Treasurer aware of the impact of different approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Capricornia for her question. Once again, this year's budget was a plan for a stronger economy, and lower and more competitive taxes for individuals and for businesses is a key part of that plan for a stronger economy. And substantially, that plan has been legislated. Personal income tax relief, some $144 billion, legislated by the parliament. Our relief for small and medium-sized businesses up to $50 million, that's been legislated by the parliament. Our plan for a stronger economy is being implemented. We're getting on with the job, and we obviously want to see the balance of that plan for a stronger economy by ensuring all businesses have access to competitive taxes because of the jobs that depend on them. Now, we know that Labor is going to roll back $70 billion worth of tax relief for personal income taxpayers in Australia. They're going to continue to oppose the extension of more competitive tax rates for all businesses, Mr Speaker. But the one thing the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Labor Party, announced today in his captain's call was he is going to remove the tax relief for businesses between $10 and $50 million. Unilaterally, he went out there. After the end of the speech, the member for McMahon was nowhere to be seen. Normally when they announce tax policy, they're there side by side, but not today, Mr Speaker. He went out there and he just snuck it out there. $10 to $50 million in turnover. They are rolling back, Mr Speaker. That's 20,000 businesses, 20,000 businesses paying higher taxes. There's 1.5 million Australians who work for those 20,000 companies. That's an average of 75 people working each of those businesses. And the Leader of the Labor Party thinks there's some multinational juggernaut, Mr Speaker. Well, GP graders at Mount Waverley, they have a turnover between 10 and 50. They've got 90 staff. Modular Walls in my own electorate of Kurnell, Mr Speaker, they've got 50 employees. And of course, in the member for Capricornia's electorate, as I've reminded the House before, Coxon's Radiators, 35 employees. That's not a multinational. That's not the top end of town. That is a hard-working Australian family business in regional Australia, and the Leader of the Labor Party wants to kick them in the guts, Mr Speaker, by jacking up their taxes. They're not the big end of town. They're family businesses, Mr Speaker. They're family businesses. The Leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, we used to have leaders of the Labor Party who talked about the ladder of opportunity. You remember that? Well, this Labor leader is all about the snake of envy, Mr Speaker. That's what he's about. The Australians slide down. They'll slide down the totem pole, Mr Speaker, under this Leader of the Opposition's policies, and the blood supply will be constricted by the boa constrictor over there, Mr Speaker. The boa constrictor, Mr Speaker, suffocating the economy, cutting off the blood supply, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party are all about. Higher taxes, cutting off the blood supply to our economy like the boa constrictor.
The member for Port Adelaide has the call. Member for Moreton is warned.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Just last month, the Chair of the Energy Security Board repeated the consensus view that there would be absolutely no way that anybody would be financing a new coal-fired power generation plant, and that this was not contentious at a factual level. So how can the Prime Minister today tell the parliament that coal-fired power might be around forever? Is there nothing this Prime Minister won't do to stop the members for Warringah and Hughes from crossing the floor and undermining his government?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I'm not quite sure what the honourable member believes qualifies him to have some sort of infallible crystal ball, but over the years I've found that predictions about technology are often mistaken, and so that you're better off recognising
The member
that,
for Port Adelaide has asked his question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that coal-fired power is a big part of our energy mix at the moment. It will be a big part for a very long time and may very well be forever. We'll find out in many years to come. The reality is, in the here and now, we need to have cheaper and more reliable power. And the honourable member knows better than most that in his state, that combination of left-wing Labor ideology led by the now dismissed Labor government, dismissed by the people of South Australia, that combined with utter incompetence resulted in his state having the most expensive and the least reliable electricity in Australia. We are delivering more reliable and more affordable power because we are working on it with the benefit of engineering and economics. I know they are strangers to the honourable member, but believe me, they are the guides to a more affordable and reliable energy future for all Australians.
Just before I call the member for Denison, I'd like to inform the House that present in the gallery this afternoon is a delegation from Vanuatu, led by the Minister for Infrastructure and Public Utilities. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome to you. And we also have joining us this afternoon a delegation from Fiji. On behalf of the House, I also extend a warm welcome to you as well. And I call the member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, federal government departments are increasingly entering into single contracts with national suppliers at the expense of smaller Tasmanian companies hoping to supply goods and services exclusively or principally in Tasmania. The result of this discriminatory contracting is often substandard and expensive goods and services. Because Tasmania is obviously a unique regional and rural market, physically dislocated from the mainland. Quite simply, Tasmania is entirely unfamiliar to many national suppliers who don't even have a presence there. Prime Minister, will you review this matter so that Australians relying on federal government agencies located in Tasmania and Tasmanians relying on local federal government services start getting a better deal?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for his question. Mr. Speaker, in March 2017, so last year, the government made significant changes to procurement rules to maximise competition and ensure that Australian businesses of all sizes are able to compete for government contracts on a level footing. We want to see more government work going to local businesses. And there's many reasons why that should be done, accountability being one of them, local jobs being another, the connectedness and engagement with the community being vitally important. Now, of course, taxpayer value for money is the primary test. Naturally, it is taxpayers' money which must be spent as prudently as possible. Now, the new Commonwealth procurement rules require that benefit to the Australian economy be considered when assessing the value for money of tenders for non-construction procurements above $4 million and construction procurements above $7.5 million. And potential suppliers to government, will continue to be treated equitably and cannot be discriminated against based on their size, location or ownership. More broadly, the government is backing business to create local jobs, including in Tasmania, where there are over 1,200 businesses with a turnover between $2 million and $50 million. Now, one of them that I mentioned a moment ago, Stubbs Constructions in Burnie, is a good example of the type of Tasmanian business that the member for Denison should be fighting for as he stands up and condemns, as I trust he will, Labor's disgraceful announcement today that it is going to jack up the company tax on small and medium family-owned businesses, including in Tasmania. The honourable member knows that Tasmania is doing better than it has for many years. It's got a good Liberal government under Will Hodgman. It's benefiting from our pro-growth policies here in Canberra, and we have provided real incentive to those Tasmanian businesses and others like them around the country. Labor is going to, in this captain's call, aimed at the member for Grainler, a rebuke to the member for Grainler out of the indignation and vanity of the Leader of the Opposition. He's announced today, without any consultation, that those very Tasmanian businesses are going to have to pay more tax under a Labor government. The honourable member should be well aware of that and should be saying to his constituents what a shocking threat to their jobs the Labor Party represents.
And just before I call the member for Chisholm, we also have present in the gallery the Honourable Ben Carroll MP, Victorian Minister for Industry and Employment. On behalf of the House, I extend a warm welcome to you as well, and I call the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister update the House on how the government's plan for lower taxes, jobs and growth through trade and investment is helping grow the economy? Is the minister aware of any alternative plans?
The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. The member for McMahon will cease interjecting.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, I'm grateful for the question because it does highlight the fact that on this side of the House we are so absolutely committed and focused on making sure we open up more export opportunities for Australian businesses. And we've done that, Mr Speaker, in a number of ways. Of course, we opened up important markets, export markets that are helping to power Australia's economic growth and job creation, like China, Japan, Korea, and of course the TPP-11, which the Leader of the Opposition said was a vanity project and a waste of time, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which the Leader of the Opposition called a dud deal. But we continue to open up these opportunities because we know they're good for Australia's businesses. We know the Export Behaviour and Business Performance Report showed that Australian export businesses pay their employees more and they increase wages at a faster rate. And many of these export businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises. Businesses like King Island Kelp, which exports to the EU and other markets, a great example in northwest Tasmania of a business that's exporting to the world, helping to drive our economy and helping to make sure that they create jobs. But the question is, are there alternatives? Well, there are alternative approaches, because what we saw today in the captain's call from the Leader of the Opposition was a decision to abandon those small to medium-sized enterprises, a decision to walk away despite the fact that historically this Leader of the Opposition backed it. He actually said in 2011 reducing the corporate tax rate will then flow onto workers in the form of higher wages. So now we see a backflip on tax, but he's combining that backflip with a triple rollback. A rollback on small business tax cuts, a rollback on personal income tax cuts and a rollback on border protection. They're going to take away income tax cuts from 9 million Australians. They're going to hit 20,000 businesses that employ 1.5 million Australians with a tax sledgehammer. But the fact is, they're not all like that on that side. The fact is there are one or two over there who have a different view. We have, of course, the member for Grainler, old who me elbow, who me, he says to the Sydney Morning Herald.
The minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
Certainly, Mr Speaker. Well, we know that that member, Mr Speaker, he has a different view. You see, he sees himself as the new messiah of the Australian Labor Party. He wants to lead them into the promised land. But like the life of Brian on that side, Mr Speaker, like the life of Brian, you've got the opposition frantically ringing up the backbench saying he's not the messiah, he's just a very naughty boy. Because we can see today they're opening the gulf between the two of them. They're opening the gulf. Of course, he claims he's not the Messiah either, but like that immortal line from Monty Python, only the true Messiah would deny his divinity. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that we now see the splits opening up on Labor. He's going hard left and he's trying to be more centrist.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the Energy Council has called new coal-fired power stations uninvestable and said the industry has no plans to start building new coal-fired power stations? Energy Australia has said coal-fired power is a legacy technology. It's a solution my grandfather would have built. AGL has said we do not believe any private capital will invest in new coal plants, and Origin has said it's unlikely we'd be an investor in new coal. So how on earth can the Prime Minister suggest twice today in Parliament that coal-fired power might be around forever?
The member's time has concluded. The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I haven't had a question from the member for Port Adelaide for 250 days, Mr Speaker. He lost his seat. He lost his seat, he lost the presidency, now he's lost his relevance, Mr Speaker. Now, the reality, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister said, coal is a critical part of our energy mix. It makes up around 70% of the capacity in the national electricity market. And the member for Port Adelaide knows what happened in South Australia when the Northern Power Station closed and the wholesale prices went up by more than 80%. And the member for Maribyrnong now turns his back because it was a Labor government of Victoria that tripled the royalties on the coal-fired power stations of Victoria, saw the closure of Hazelwood, which also saw wholesale prices in Victoria going up 80%, Mr Speaker. And now it's up to the Labor Party to tell the workers, the blue-collar workers in the mines and the power stations across the country, that their policies will close them down and put them out of a job. Will they go to the electorate of Flynn and tell the 230 workers at the Gladstone power plant that under their policy they'll be out of a job? Will they go to the electorate of Gippsland and tell the 500 workers at the Yallourn power plant that under the Labor Party's emissions intensity scheme they'll lose their job? And will they go to the member for Shortland's electorate, Mr Speaker, and tell the 300 workers there at Vales Point that under the Labor Party's policy that they'll lose their job? Now, Mr Speaker, when it comes to coal, we know that you can't trust what the Labor Party says, because the member for Shortland is the Shadow Minister, Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, and he proudly put on his website, about the Carmichael mine, and I quote, "I welcome the jobs that it will provide in Queensland," Mr Speaker. Now, what do you think his website now says, Mr Speaker? What do you think the member? He's gone to the school, the same school of websites that the member for Barton went to, Mr Speaker, because now his website says the following: "I remain opposed to the Carmichael mine." Mr Speaker, I remain opposed to the. So the Labor Party, the Leader of the Opposition, he will go to the miners in Mackay and tell them he supports coal. He will then go to the baristas of Batman and tell them that coal has no future. Mr Speaker, don't look at what Labor says, look what Labor does. Only the coalition can be trusted to deliver more reliable and affordable power.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on why it's important to have a tax system that rewards all Australians, including in my electorate of Latrobe? Is the minister aware of any threats posed by alternative schemes?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. And like those on this side of the chamber, he knows that 94% of Australians under our personal income tax plan will pay no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar, which means hard-working Australians will be able to keep more of the income that they earn. He also knows that we on this side of the chamber encourage enterprise. We believe in having an enterprise tax plan that will ensure that businesses in Australia will be able to, again, employ more Australians and invest more in their businesses and remain competitive in our global economy. And it will allow businesses, including around 16,000 businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises in his electorate of Latrobe, to be able to grow, to invest and to pay their workers even more. These are tax policies that reward hard work and aspiration. Those opposite used to believe in enterprise and aspiration, but sadly no more. They, of course, have a different view on these policies because they voted against. They voted against lower, simpler and fairer taxes for millions of Australians. And thanks to an absolute cluster of a captain's call today from the Leader of the Opposition, they have confirmed that they will oppose, in fact they will roll back small and medium-sized enterprises and their tax benefits Small and medium-sized enterprises that, by the way, employ around about 1.5 million Australians. Do they not understand that small and medium-sized enterprises in this country make up 97% of all business in this country? They are the hard-working engine room of our Australian economy, and they consist of mechanics, they consist of restaurants, they consist of builders and car dealers. These are the small businesses, small, medium-sized and family businesses that those opposite want to impose higher taxes on. According to the Leader of the Opposition, with his cluster of a captain's call today, they are apparently the top end of town. Now, I can't believe it. These are the top end of town. He wants to hike taxes on these small, family-sized enterprises. He wants to hike taxes on the people that they employ, and he also wants to be able to hike taxes on retirees as well with his mega retirees tax. Do they not understand? Do they not understand that these people are the hard-working people of Australia? They are creating opportunity in our economy. They are the people that we should back. They are the people that we should support. They are employing fellow Australians, yet they would punish them. Only the Coalition can be trusted to protect their interests. The Leader of the Opposition cannot.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. It's reported that a deal between One Nation and the government to give big business an $80 billion handout was more likely after the upcoming by-elections. Why is the government negotiating with One Nation to give big business an $80 billion handout after the by-elections? Don't voters in Longman, Braddon, Mayo, Fremantle and Perth deserve to know the truth about this government teaming up with One Nation to give the bank $17 billion?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the honourable members asked me about the voters in Longman being entitled to hear the truth, and that is absolutely right. They are. They are, and they did not get the truth from the Leader of the Opposition on the 22nd of June when he was on radio. And he was on radio and he said that you could not get chemotherapy on Bribie. You'd have to go to Brisbane to get it. Couldn't get it anywhere near Caboolture. And a lady called Patsy called in. She rang in to the radio program and she sought to correct the Leader of the Opposition. It is one of the most excruciating calls to listen to. The patronising way in which he talks over Patsy, cuts her off, does not want to listen to her, and he says, Patsy, I can't see why you're so frustrated. And Patsy, Mr Speaker, spoke for all Australians, and certainly all the voters in Longman, when she said, I'm frustrated because you're not telling the truth, for God's sake.
Members on my right, the member for Goldstone is warned.
She called him out for one falsehood after another. And then when she sought
the member
to
for
correct
Patterson,
him about
the member
the
for
state
Patterson
of
is warned.
affairs at the hospital and health in Caboolture, he talked over the top of her again. And he said, in a rather patronising way, well, we disagree there, Patsy. You're entitled to your opinion. And she said, again, speaking for all Australians and certainly everyone in Longman, are you serious? I live here. I know. And, Mr Speaker, the fact is that the Leader of the Opposition is misleading the people in Longman as he is misleading the people in Braddon and right around the country.
The member for Solomon will leave under 94A.
About the funding to Caboolture Hospital is false, absolutely false. Funding has increased, and even when Patsy, living in Caboolture, calls up and seeks to set the facts straight based on her knowledge of living in Caboolture and using the services at the hospital and the medical services, when she calls up this arrogant, out-of-touch Leader of the Opposition, talks over the top of her,
the Prime
and
Minister,
says rather grandly,
Prime Minister will resume his
entitled.
seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Whitlam will just leave the chamber under 94A. I made it clear to all members a couple of question times ago that some of those words that the Prime Minister just used I didn't like in questions, I don't like in answers either, and I'd ask the Prime Minister to desist. Prime Minister, has he concluded his answer, or there's 10 seconds left?
Mr. Speaker, I just say again, Patsy spoke for all Australians when she said to the Leader of the Opposition, "I'm frustrated because you're not telling the truth, for God's sake."
The member for Corangamite has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Will the minister update the House on how the government's tax cuts benefit small and family businesses, including in my electorate of Corangamite? How would small and family businesses suffer if these tax cuts were repealed?
Greatly. The member for Small and Family Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for a question and a passion for small and family businesses. Mr Speaker, today we've seen the latest demonstration of the ignorance of the Leader of the Opposition when it comes to how small and family businesses in this country operate. One of the most valuable business lessons I've learned in my life is that you don't live off turnover, a business lives off their profit. Parramatta Road runs right through. Parramatta Road runs right through my electorate, and the Leader of the Opposition would have you believe that Tom and his wife, who are car wholesalers, flip 4 to 5 cars a week, on average 20 grand a car, turning over $5.5 million a year, are a big business. They work out of a briefcase and off a mobile phone. The Leader of the Opposition will tell you that Rob and his father, who sell farm equipment in northern New South Wales, bits of gear on average between 200 to 500 grand a pop, that turns over $25 million a year, is a big business. The reason he doesn't get it, Mr Speaker, is he's never done it. He wants to sully the reputation of the Prime Minister, who has, in his life pre-politics, taken on truckloads of bank debt, employed truckloads of people and paid truckloads of tax. He wants to sully not just his reputation, but anyone that's done that. The reality is, when it comes to the Leader of the Opposition, the biggest financial transaction he will undertake in his life, Mr Speaker, is to sign his mortgage documents. That's the reality. He wants to run the biggest business in this country with no understanding of how business actually operates. And when it comes to small and family businesses, what do? Like the Prime Minister has done, like Tom, like Rob and his father, they put their families' home on the line. Why? To give their children more opportunities than they've had. They are an invaluable part of the local community. That is why, for 4.5 years, the Turnbull Coalition government has stood with them. That's why today we stand shoulder to shoulder with them. That's how the results, 1 million jobs, highest business confidence, 158,000 small and family businesses net opening in the last 4.5 years. That's how you get the numbers. The Leader of the Opposition doesn't get it because he's never done it. He wants to take an axe to people prepared to put their families' home on the line to get their family ahead. That's what aspiration is, Mr Speaker. That's what aspiration is. We get it on this side of the House. A lot of us has actually done it pre-politics and will, who knows, go back to doing it post-politics, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has never done it in his life, yet wants to present himself to the Australian people as an alternate and at the same time sully the reputation of someone that gets on. Today Labor declared war on small and family business, Mr Speaker. Make no bones about it.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last year, the National Australia Bank made a net profit of about $5 billion, but cut 6,000 jobs. Why is the Prime Minister trying to cut a deal with One Nation to reward the big banks with a $17 billion handout? Why did this Prime Minister's arrogant and out-of-touch policies always reward the top end of town while workers get punished?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond to the question. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party keeps talking about the top end of town. And we talked about this yesterday. What the Labor Party are doing by opposing the Turnbull government's enterprise tax plan, which will ensure that Australian businesses pay competitive rates of tax. If we do not make this change, Australia will have the second highest tax rate of businesses anywhere in the developed world. That's where they want. That's where they want Australia to be. They want to be up there with the second highest rate of business taxes in the world, and somehow that is supposed to drive our economy forward. As I said yesterday, the top end of town that benefits from what Labor is doing is the top end of town in Manhattan and in San Francisco and in Dallas and in Houston and in Singapore and in Hong Kong and in London and all of these places, because what the Labor Party want to do is ensure that the businesses that Australian businesses compete with, they will have lower rates of tax than Australia will. So he wants to send jobs offshore. The Labor Party wants to send jobs offshore, want to send investment offshore, Mr Speaker. This is a Labor Party that does not understand, as the Minister for Small and Family Businesses just demonstrated, how the economy can grow. We are now the absolute inheritors of the ladder of opportunity, Mr Speaker. We have always been that. We have always understood the aspiration of how people have been able to get ahead in life, no better demonstrated than the Prime Minister himself, Mr Speaker, working away over many, many years. We understand that. But the snaky way that this leader of this Labor Party go about, Mr Speaker, economic policy, setting one group of Australians against another, demonising one while trying to pretend they're doing something for others. It's very snaky, Mr Speaker. I was talking about the boa constrictor before, the one that suffocates and constricts the blood supply to the body as it defeats it, Mr Speaker. That's what Labor's policy will do to our economy. But there are plenty of other snaky characters, Mr Speaker. Plenty of them. If you look at the king brown snake, it has the largest recorded venom output of any in the world, Mr Speaker. Who does that remind me of, Mr Speaker? The Leader of the Opposition.
I just say to the Treasurer, I don't like the track he's going down. He's about to get bitten.
The snakes and ladders approach of tax policy that we've seen from the Labor Party, saying to people that they reckon they'll put them on the ladder of the opportunity, and the truth is they're just going to slide all the way to the bottom under Labor's tax policy.
The member for Calare.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how tax relief for hard-working Australians and record infrastructure spending is benefiting communities around Australia? And do alternate ideas pose risks for hard-working Australians trying to get ahead?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll happily update the House on that. Hard-working Australians should be able to keep more of their money. The Liberal and Nationals government's policy is as simple as that. Now, the member for Calare is part of a government rewarding hard work and opportunity, rewarding hard-working Australians, a government helping them to get ahead, a government backing their aspirations. It's not mystifying. It's not mystifying members for Sydney. That's why we legislated once-in-a-generational tax relief for workers last week, due to take effect from 1 July. That's why we cut the small business tax rate to its lowest level last year in 77 years. And that's why we redefined small business to help more job-creating local small businesses qualify for tax relief. Small businesses like Angus Barrett, a saddler and a leather goods retailer in the member for Calare's electorate in Orange. So he can grow, he can expand his small business, and he can hire more locals, put on more people. He and his wife Sarah already have 16 staff, 16 hard-working staff. But Angus and Sarah, they aspire to keep growing and to keep hiring. They want a bigger local business. And he told the member for Calare it's impossible to grow, hire more staff and spend more money on a business if we're hamstrung by taxes. And he's so right. The Liberal and Nationals are backing the Central West through infrastructure investment, through tax relief and making sure that product gets to market sooner and safer. And this includes more than $2.3 million in infrastructure for bridge replacements, including the Browns Creek Road Bridge, which the member for Calare and I visited recently, a $2.5 million upgrade of Bathurst Airport, and $10 million for Velocity Park under the Building Better Regions Fund. Now, around Australia, our tax cuts and our infrastructure investment are creating confidence They're helping hard-work Australians and small businesses to get ahead, like the 12,201 small businesses in the electorate of Longman, throughout places such as Caboolture, Burpengary and Bribie Island. We have legislated tax cuts for all of those small businesses in Longman. The member for Clare, he represents many small businesses. He represents the town of Bathurst, and I had great cause the other day to reflect about Bathurst and those sorts of people who come out of Bathurst, such as that great Labor leader Ben Chifley from that great central western New South Wales town. Now, when Labor had a leader who was a worker, a railway man, who wanted to help workers get ahead, a leader whose vision became the light on the hill. Gone is the light on the hill. Now we have a light on the bill. And who's putting a light on the opposition leader? That's right, the member for Grainler. He's putting a light on the bill, and we know that he's put him in the spotlight. That man there, the leader of the opposition, the member for Maribyrnong Under, whose legacy, Labor's legacy, is in tatters.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. This morning, the Treasurer said about his $80 billion big business tax cut, and I quote, "I don't consider tax relief a cost to the budget." Is the reason the government's $80 billion big business tax cut is unfunded because the Treasurer believes he can conjure the money out of thin air? Isn't it a fact that spending $80 billion on a big business tax cut just means more cuts to Medicare, schools and the pension?
The member for Barker is warned. The Treasurer has the call.
Reducing company tax promotes investment, creates jobs, drives growth. Who said that? Member for McMahon, 2013. The snake charmer over there, the member for Rankin.
The Treasurer will withdraw that.
I withdraw. Australia would go well out of a lower company rate than it is right now, 2016. Leader of the Opposition, cutting the company tax rate increases domestic productivity and domestic investment. More capital means higher productivity and economic growth and leads to more jobs and higher wages. Leader of the Opposition. The member for Lilly, reducing company tax will create new jobs and grow the economy right around the country to the ultimate benefit of all Australians. And the former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, if you're against cutting company tax, you're against economic growth. Mr Speaker, the hide of the member for McMahon. My point, Mr Speaker, is simply this. On this side of the House, we understand that what people earn is their money, and I'm not going to call that a cost. I'm not going to call that a giveaway when we give them tax relief, Mr Speaker. The revenue estimates are set out in the budget. The budget returns to balance a year earlier than we projected. Net debt turns the corner this year, Mr Speaker, $30 billion down over the next 4 years, $230 billion over the next 10 years, unemployment falling, more than 1 million people in jobs, AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker. That's our record, Mr Speaker. What their record was gross debt running at over 30%. 30%. In this budget, we've got that down to 2%, Mr Speaker. 30% under Labor, down to 2%. And the reason, and this year, Mr Speaker, no longer under this government are we borrowing to pay for everyday expenditure like pensions and schools and hospitals. The only reason we're issuing government securities today is for the defence industry plan, which is creating jobs, the infrastructure plan, which is creating jobs, and because we refuse to raid the Future Fund, Mr Speaker. We refuse to raid the Future Fund. I look forward to the Shadow Treasurer being told what his policy is by that with the next captain's call from the Leader of Opposition.
The member for Menzies.
Mr Speaker, I asked the Minister for Defence Industry to update the House on how equipping the Australian Defence Force with the Triton unmanned aerial vehicle will enhance the capability of defending our national interests, and I ask him, secondly, he's aware of any approaches that would undermine this.
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call. Members on my left. The Minister has
Mr Speaker,
the call.
I thank the member for Menzies for his question. Mr Speaker, because of the government's excellent management of the economy and because of the Treasurer's management of the budget, we can afford to make announcements like the one we've made today to purchase the first of the Triton unmanned aerial vehicles at a cost of $1.4 billion, the first of 6, at a cost of $6.9 billion, Mr Speaker. Governments like this one can do that because we're managing the budget and managing the economy. And governments like the one that we replaced, the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government, couldn't do that because of the way they couldn't manage the budget or manage the economy. In fact, under Labor, Mr Speaker, spending on defence dropped to 1.56% of GDP, the lowest since 1938, the lowest since the last year of appeasement. And because of this government's management of the budget and the economy, we'll get to 2% of GDP in 2020, a year ahead of schedule, a year ahead of what we'd promised, because we're pulling our weight, Mr Speaker. We want to be a good ally, we want to look after our own national interests, and today we went even further along that road by announcing that we would buy the Triton unmanned aerial vehicles, a capability which means we'll have reconnaissance and surveillance across 10% of the world's surface, because one of the most important things we do as a nation, as part of the Five Eyes, is the reconnaissance and surveillance of the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, Southeast Asia and, of course, to Antarctica. It's an important responsibility. These Tritons will be able to cover that area, working with the Poseidons, which are replacing the Orion aircraft, at a cost of $6.9 billion. But that's not all, Mr Speaker. $2.6 billion of that will be spent here in Australia, growing Australian industry capabilities, the sophisticated, highly technical jobs that we want in an advanced manufacturing economy, in businesses like Ferret Engineering, in the member for Bonner's election, and Mincham Aviation in Adelaide, Mr Speaker. These are real businesses, businesses that have been given a leg up because of the company tax cuts that we've managed to deliver. And if we can get the rest of our company tax cuts through the Senate, growing the economy, growing jobs, reducing the tax burden. Today, the Leader of the Opposition said that he was going to rip those tax cuts away from small and family businesses, Mr Speaker. It was an absolutely disgraceful captain's call on the part of the Leader of the Opposition without any consultation, but I can tell you it is the beginning of the end for leaders of the opposition when they start thinking they can get away with this stuff, Mr Speaker. The truth is he needed to consult with his party room, with his shadow cabinet, before he decided to throw all those small and medium businesses between $2 and $50 million turnover a year to the wolves. They need the certainty of tax policy that we are providing. They don't need the Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Ballarat.
We got there via the planes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. By the time they are fully implemented, Stage 3 of the government's personal income tax scheme and its big business handout will cost at least $25 billion a year. Where is the money coming from? Won't this government giving $25 billion to big business and the top 20% of income earners just mean even more cuts to schools, to Medicare and to pensions?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is mystified by aspiration, and the honourable member who's just asked me the question is mystified as to where the money comes from to fund government services. Well, I'll let the honourable member know it comes from hard-working Australians' income. It comes from Australian businesses making profits and paying tax. And it is their energy, their enterprise, their aspiration which drives the Australian economy. Nothing more clearly distinguishes the unreality, the disconnectedness, the out-of-touch nature of modern Labor, that they do not recognise that everything we do here, every dollar we spend, comes from the efforts of hard-working Australian families. It is them, it is their work, it is their money. And when we cut taxes, what we are doing is enabling Australians to keep more of their money. The Labor Party thinks it is the government giving them a gift. Well, that's wrong. It is not the government's money, it's a hard-working Australian family's money. We are able, through good budget management, to pay for all of those essential services, including the ones Labor neglected, like those pharmaceutical benefits listings which were deferred in 2011, as Labor's budget showed. Labor couldn't fund the PBS. Labor neglected those services. We're funding them fully with increasing amounts every year. We're keeping our nation safe, as the minister has just described, and we're doing that, providing more tax relief to hard-working families and Australian businesses and bringing the budget back into balance a year earlier. That is the difference between strong economic management under the coalition versus the shocking performance and the debt and the deficit and the failure and disappointments of the Labor Party.
The member for Swan.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a strong and consistent approach to maintaining the integrity of Australia's borders? Is the minister aware of any differing views which may put our borders at risk?
Good question. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, and like all Australians, he's very concerned about making sure that our country, as an island nation, has secure borders. We need to secure our borders so that we can keep our country safe. I hear an interjection from the African Queen of— Mr Speaker, from the member for
the Minister will withdraw.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker. Aspiration is not a location within Africa. Just to clarify for the honourable member opposite, this has been a very confusing week for the honourable member opposite. Don't forget, Mr Speaker, she was one of the people sitting around the cabinet table in the glorious Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years when 50,000 people came on 800 boats, and tragically, Mr Speaker, 1,200 people drowned at sea. Now, remarkably, the Labor Party, under this Leader of the Opposition, want to return a future Labor government back to the delivery of that disaster. It would be an atrocious outcome. And, Mr Speaker, if you live in Caboolture or Burpengary or Wamuran at the moment and you're thinking about voting in the upcoming by-election, you will recognise that Labor says anything in opposition but does the complete opposite in relation to border protection when they get into government. And, Mr Speaker, at the moment, this Leader of the Opposition, who is tricky— I mean, people have doubts about him with— have a look at his track record. They have justification for knowing that he is tricky at the moment. He's just holding together the Labor Party's position on border protection with the support of our old friends from the CFMEU. Now, Mr Speaker, the CFMEU is essentially a modern-day mafia organised crime group. We know that they have paid $15.2 million in fines and that members of the CFMEU have been charged with 982 offences. Now, Mr Speaker, last time that happened under the BLF, Bob Hawke had the guts and the leadership to disassociate the Labor Party from the BLF, to deregister them and not to accept their money. What we're seeing from this Leader of the Opposition, a man who is more unworthy than any leader of the Labor Party in modern times, is somebody who accepts every dollar from the Labor Party and somebody who is relies on the CFMEU to get his policies through conference. Now, Mr Speaker, the members in the electorate of Longman, the constituents in the electorate of Longman and in Braddon and elsewhere around the country in the by-elections know that this man is unfit to hold high office in this country. And, Mr Speaker, we know that under Labor they say one thing in opposition, but when they get back into government they deliver disaster, particularly when it comes to border protection policies.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister consider that the big banks deserve a $17 billion tax cut?
The Prime Minister has the call. The member for McEwen's warned.
Well, Mr Speaker, the big banks are, of course, paying the major bank levy right at the moment. It's about $1.5 billion a year. Yeah, so it's a very, very substantial additional levy. Mr Speaker, the honourable member is running his, despite the protestations, member for Grayndler is running his campaign against business. It's not just the big banks he's against or big companies. It's businesses right down to businesses of $2 million turnover. It's Stubbs Constructions in Burnie with 63 employees. It's Kennedy's Timber in Brisbane. He is running a campaign against businesses, small, medium and large.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, on direct relevance. The Prime Minister mightn't like the question, but it was specifically about, do the big banks consider and deserve a $17 billion tax handout from this Prime Minister? Do you believe that?
Members on my right, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, yet again you hear him talking about tax handouts. Tax handouts. The reality is this, that the government's, every dollar of the government's revenues comes from Australian families' efforts, Australian businesses' efforts, and what we need to have is a competitive tax
member for
system.
Sydney.
The honourable member opposite used to say that lower company taxes gives us a more competitive economy, as most of his front bench have done at one time or another. They've all said the same thing, and they understand that you've got to have a competitive tax system in Australia to encourage investment and growth and to secure jobs. The Labor Party used to believe that, and they have failed it. And the honourable member opposite just should remember that his ability to keep on repeating falsehoods doesn't make them true. It's not just Patsy that's awake to him on Brisbane radio. We all know one falsehood after another. It's about time he started telling it.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, I'm raising the point of order that there wasn't a ruling earlier as to whether or not the Prime Minister was being relevant, and I'm asking for that ruling to be given.
Sure. I listened obviously very carefully to both the question. The member for Latrobe will cease interjecting. The restatement of the question with some additional words, and whilst those on my left were demanding a yes-no answer, it's very clear in the practice that they can't demand that. The Prime Minister was being relevant to the question of tax, and I was. I'm not going to have the member for Lingiari lecture me by way of interjection. Well, I will talk to you later, after you've left the chamber. Good.
9 in.
The member for Lingiari will come back and resume his seat. Before I name the member for Lingiari, I'm going to give him an opportunity to stand up and withdraw his comments. The only reason I'm not naming him is my respect for the other members on both sides who want to pursue question time. The member for Lingiari.
I withdraw.
And the member for Lingiari will leave under 94A. The question was about company tax. I was listening very carefully to the Prime Minister's answer. I agree it was a specific question, but the Prime Minister was relevant to the question of tax. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on the action the government is taking to bring down energy prices and support business and industries across Australian economy? And what are the alternatives to the government's plan for affordable energy?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Grey for his question. And he has lived experience with the failure of Labor's energy policies, Mr Speaker. He comes from the state of South Australia, which had the highest prices in the country, and had the inglorious experience of a statewide blackout that cost that state $500 million. $500 million. That's enough to build 30 primary schools, Mr Speaker, to upgrade 10 local hospitals, to build important regional roads, Mr Speaker. And one of the biggest casualties of that statewide blackout in South Australia was BHP, with 3,000 workers in his electorate at Olympic Dam, Mr Speaker. They had a $100 million cost because of Labor's statewide blackout. And today BHP, the largest resource company in the world, came together with the CEO of BlueScope, Australia's largest manufacturer, and the leaders of the National Farmers Federation, the Minerals Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group and the Business Council of Australia. And they came to Parliament with a very clear and unequivocal message that the National Energy Guarantee is in the national interest, Mr Speaker. And they have told us that under the National Energy Guarantee, electricity prices will fall, stability will increase, Mr Speaker, and we will get the investment certainty that the sector so badly needs, Mr Speaker. Those companies and those groups represented 5 million Australian workers, more than 150,000 businesses and more than $200 billion of exports each and every year. And under the National Energy Guarantee, wholesale prices will fall by 23%. So if you're a chemical manufacturer, this could be worth $1 million in decreased energy bills to your business. If you're a paper manufacturer, it could be worth $10 million a year, Mr Speaker. If you're a large supermarket, it could be a reduction of $400,000 a year, Mr Speaker, not to mention the average Australian household, which will be $300 a year better off under the National Energy Guarantee than under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. Now, power prices are falling. We've seen the big three across New South Wales, South Australia and Queensland reduce their power prices. And PowerShop, as I mentioned to the parliament yesterday, an emerging retailer, have decreased their offerings for small business in Queensland by more than 14%, worth more than $1,400 a year, and more than 8% for households worth more than $140 a year. So, Mr Speaker, the National Energy Guarantee is good for jobs. It's good for business. It's good for the economy. Only the coalition can be trusted to deliver lower power prices.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said earlier that the government's budget is funded by hard-working Australian families. So why is the Prime Minister taking $80 billion from hard-working families and the services they rely on and giving it straight to big business?
The Prime Minister has the call.
This is Mike.
Is this a trick question?
It wasn't a trick question. That's a trick question.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's obvious that economics has joined aspiration and geography as mysteries to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, when governments reduce tax, whether it is personal income tax, as we have done last week, or business tax, which, as we did last year, and of course, as the opposition is proposing to jack up business taxes again, when tax is reduced, the government is not giving anything away. It is taxpayers' money. It is taxpayers' money that the government is taking less of. Now, the fact that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition does not understand this speaks volumes for the contempt the Labor Party holds Australians, hard-working Australians and businesses, large and small.
The member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Health. Well, the Minister outlined to the House how a strong economy enables government to deliver record investment and critical health services for both regional and rural health in Australia, and is the Minister aware of any other approaches?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Wright, who came to this place as the owner and operator of a family business, a trucking business, Scotty the Truckie. And the whole point about that is that he knows that you can only create a successful business in the same way that you create a successful economy, with a plan, and that plan can help create jobs. And those jobs, in the case of the country, over 1 million jobs, help allow us to provide essential services such as record funding for Medicare, record funding for the PBS, along with the guarantee that we will list every medicine that the PBAC recommends. And we compare that, of course, with what Labor said in its 2011 budget. Given the current fiscal environment, the listing of some medicines would be deferred until fiscal circumstances permit. So that's what Labor does with health. But we know that in the member for Rights area, what we've been able to see through the record funding is an increase in hospital funding. In particular, the Gatton Hospital is part of the West Moreton district. And how much has funding gone up under the Commonwealth? 25%. How much has it gone up under Queensland Labor? 5%. 25% under us, 5% under Queensland Labor. But that's a pattern, because it's a pattern we've also seen in Tasmania. In Tasmania, we've had a $294 million last year of Commonwealth funding from Labor, but already we're at $419 million under us and increasing every year to $515 million under the National Health Reform Agreement that the Prime Minister has put forward and which we have already agreed with Tasmania. Now, an interesting thing here is that Labor has a pattern of lying. They've said that we're trying to cut funding in Tasmania to northern Tasmanian hospitals by $1 million. And yet our funding isn't just up by $1 million, not by $10 million, not by $100 million, but by more than $1 billion. We see $370 million over the course of the Hospital Reform Agreement and $730 million for the Mersey Hospital. So $1.1 billion all up. So funding up under us, funding down under Labor in the Caboolture area, funding failing the challenge in the West Moreton area. So around Australia, what you see is that the coalition, because of its economic management, can protect the PBS, invest in hospitals, increase spending and deliver new jobs. That's about managing the economy and delivering essential services.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Macquarie.
My question's to the Prime Minister. The Finance Minister has said tax cuts for the top 20% of income earners would go ahead even if another GFC hits. Given gross debt under this Prime Minister's blown out to a record $500 billion, and he's already made savage cuts, won't this just mean that if a downturn hits, this government will again cut schools, Medicare and pensions?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable member should take to task the person who wrote that question for her, because it was very, very unfair to her to have her asking a question that is so misleading and so inaccurate. In fact, spending on hospitals is increasing substantially, and the Minister for Health just described the $30 billion increase over the next 5-year agreement. And spending on schools is increasing every year because we have introduced the first truly national, consistent, needs-based Commonwealth funding policy for schools. So I thank the honourable member for a question, but the premise of it was entirely wrong. We are able to keep funding for those essential services increasing because we have the budget under control, and at the same time we could bring it back into balance a year earlier, and at the same time we are able to provide tax relief for hard-working Australian families and indeed for small and medium family businesses. The very businesses that the honourable member has many of in her electorate, which will be hit hard by a shortened Labor government. They'll be hit very hard right through the electorate of Macquarie, whether it's in the Hawkesbury or whether it's in the Blue Mountains. There are plenty of small and medium businesses, and they're getting ahead. Now they're hiring, they're working, and the honourable member will be doing the rounds there and she'll be saying, vote for the Labor Party and pay more tax. Well, I don't think that will be a very compelling message, but we don't have long to wait.
The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure and Cities, representing the Minister for Communications. Will the minister update the House on how the mobile black spot program is continuing to benefit rural and regional Australians, including in south-east Queensland? And is the minister aware of any threats to this program?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure, representing the Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Fisher for his question. He's been a strong champion of the needs of his constituents for better communications infrastructure. It was in response to advocacy from the member for Fisher and many other members on this side of the House that the Coalition has to date committed $220 million to the mobile black spots program, including on the 10th of June another $25 million being committed to this program. And, Mr Speaker, the outcomes of this investment have been very, very significant. Since the first round was announced in 2015, since that time 540 base stations around the country have been activated. 540 base stations. That is delivery. In total, 867 base stations funded under the Coalition government. And, of course, the obvious question, how many base stations were funded by Labor? Zero. Zero. Labor funded zero. Why? They don't really care about rural and regional Australia. It's outside the latte line. It's beyond the ghost cheat circle. They don't care. But on this side of the House, we are committed to delivering for the people of regional and rural Australia, including in the electorate of Fisher. 3 base stations, the Malini-Kenilworth Road, now operational. Beerwah, Glasshouse Mountains, committed to. In the nearby electorate of Longman, the last LNP member in Longman, Wyatt Roy, was very, very active. He secured 5 base stations. Mount Mee, delivered. Belthorpe Range Road, delivered. Stanmore, delivered. Beechmere and Donnybrook, in train. So that's what the Turnbull government is delivering for Australians in rural and regional Australia. Now, what did the recently departed former Labor member Susan Lamb deliver when it came to mobile coverage in Longman? Well, of course, she delivered nothing. She delivered absolutely nothing. Not one thing when it came to mobile black spots. We know she's a bit hazy on the detail. She's very hazy on the detail. Over the weekend, she confirmed that she claimed over the weekend that Caboolture has consistently rated with the highest number of complaints in Queensland for the NBN. Well, if you look at the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman Report 2016-17, page 39, it's false. Caboolture did not have the highest number of complaints. Were there, as she claimed, 50,000 complaints? No. Actually, 473. She was out by a factor of 99%. And how was Longman served? How was Longman served by the NBN under Labor? 330 connections. Under the Coalition, 43,581. That's delivery.
Very good.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed in the notice.